Well, good morning from the cottage farmstead. It's another nippy one out there today, so I figured I'd stay inside and do a little bit of prep ahead work in the kitchen for future meals. I recently used the last of my homemade bouillon powder in one of our favorite gumbo recipes, so I needed to restock that jar so that I'd be ready for another easy meal prep. Being highly sensitive to glutamate, which includes MSG, yeast extract, maltodextrin, and a lot of other things that are added to broth mixes like bouillon or the Better Than Bouillon jars, I have to make mine from scratch here at home, but it is so easy and simple using pantry staples. I found this recipe on the Life Currents blog several years ago, and I have modified it a little bit to our personal tastes. The main thing that I loved about her recipe is that I didn't have to dehydrate anything on my own. A lot of the bouillon recipes that I had seen out there, I'd have to chop up my carrots and dehydrate them and put them part of the mix. And this one, I can just pull things directly out of my pantry and get started. So I use the original ratios from the recipe when I'm making this, but I do have a few modifications that I make for our personal tastes. So I do a tablespoon of onion powder, a teaspoon and a half of garlic powder, a teaspoon of celery flakes rather than ground celery seed that she calls for, a half teaspoon of dried oregano, a half teaspoon of parsley rather than the marjoram, a half teaspoon of dried thyme, a half teaspoon of dried basil, and a quarter teaspoon of black pepper. I like making a double or triple batch of this recipe so that I'm able to fill up my broth mix jar. And that way I am ready to go whenever a recipe calls for bouillon or I need an extra cup of broth for any recipe, and I don't have to make it on demand. Well, in the original recipe, she calls for a half teaspoon per cup of water to replace broth in a recipe. I found that I like it a little bit stronger, so I usually use a full tablespoon to replace, say, a bouillon cube, or when I'm trying to make a cup of broth for a recipe, so it has a little bit stronger of a flavor. So while the broth powder mix is super convenient, I really do prefer the flavor of real broth when a recipe calls for it. So since I can't have canned or carton broth from the store due to the same reason as it's often full of artificial or added glutamate, I make my own in the Instant Pot and reserve the powder for when a recipe calls for a bouillon cube but not any additional liquid, or maybe I only had 3 cups of broth in the freezer and it calls for 4 cups, so I use it to make up the difference when needed. So when making chicken broth in the Instant Pot, I usually dump 1, sometimes 2 chicken carcasses depending on their size into the Instant Pot. So the carcasses and frames that we use for our broth come from a variety of sources. We butchered chickens last year, so I had a few frames left over from that. We have rotisserie chicken occasionally from the grocery store, or we might roast a chicken or a turkey around the holidays, and I will save the bones from that as well to use in our broth. So in addition to chicken frames, I add in a dash of apple cider vinegar. I'm not super precise when I'm measuring, but I'm aiming for about a tablespoon or 2. And that helps with pulling the minerals out of the bones to make your broth more nutritious. I also put in some salt for flavor. I grind in some black pepper as well. I also add in some celery flakes or celery seed, or if I have some celery in the fridge or the freezer, I will put that in as well for some more depth of flavor. I also sprinkle in some parsley. And the last herb I put in there is a pinch of thyme. And next up I'll be adding all the root crop flavors, so my onions, carrots, and garlic. And with these, I often save the scraps or leftovers that are just about to go bad. I toss them into the freezer. This time I had already used all of my onion scraps, but I'll save my skins and peels and put them into a Ziploc bag labeled for broth, and then I will dump that into this pot when I am making my stock so that nothing goes to waste. And lastly, I fill the Instant Pot to the max fill line for pressure cooking with water. Then I will cook it at high pressure for an hour to an hour and a half, depending on if I'm starting with a raw chicken carcass or one that has been pre-cooked. after it cools down, I pour it into mason jars, leaving plenty of head space so that it can expand in the freezer. So in quart jars, I usually just put 3 cups in, and in pint jars, I put 1.5 cups in so that there's plenty of space and my jars don't crack when they freeze. Well, I hope learning how these 2 ways to add flavor to your soups and stews this winter was helpful. Be sure to subscribe for more content from our farmhouse kitchen, and we'll catch you next time.